current new president of the association, Otago Settlers Association. So I welcome you all here today, and I'd love you to get more members and encourage people. We've got lots of great ideas coming up, and we'll make you all feel really, really welcome. So just so great to see you all, and we're going to have a great year, especially since we're having the 125th next year. Now, Jude reminded me that if you need a membership card, go and see her at the end of the session. She's the lady at the back with the clipboard. So do get a new membership card if you want one, because that will give you 20% off at the shop. So you might as well use it. Now, we're really, really lucky today to have an esteemed speaker who is Jim Sullivan, who's been, he's been so important in the role of history, and he was asked to write the history of the 100 years of radio in New Zealand, and that was with Radio Dunedin. So he's written a book, and he's going to give us a talk today on the history of radio in New Zealand, and that'd be really, really good. He's a well-renowned speaker. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. I might just hang on to that up. But can I have it up there, just in case, or down there would be fine. Yeah. Thank you. Good morning. If you need to recruit some new members, Moira, one of the starting points now is that Sullivan has done his speech for the year, so for the next 12 months you can be free of me. Bound to get you lots of members. But the invitation is much appreciated, because I think that groups like your own are doing much to preserve our heritage one way or another, knowing that all heritage matters are underfunded and need more assistance, especially from volunteers in various ways. I need to have a discussion with my producer. How do I make the slide change? See, the highly technical business, this...
the clicker ran away on us, but just press these two buttons there.
Oh, thank you. I was going to do testing to see if he was awake, because he has to go to hundreds of these things. One of the reasons for being invited, I suppose, is that there's been a little bit of publicity lately about the 100 years of Radio Dunedin, or perhaps, I think, better known to our age group as 4XD. And the idea of celebrating 100 years of a radio station, I think, is quite important, because in 100 years from now, I doubt very much whether the thing we call radio will exist in anything like the shape it does now. So if you're only going to have one centennial, then it's worth marking it. With this morning's discussion or talk, which I see you started an hour early. Or do I have to speak for an extra 60 minutes? That, I think, is a prospect none of us would want to go through. However, given that it's an excuse to talk about radio generally, I thought I would use that excuse to be rather more general, but we will have a look at some aspects of the 4XD story as they reflect the radio industry generally. So I'll have a go at that. On the screen is a picture of an old Dunedin building, and I was going to have a prize for the person who could identify the building, but then I saw that the book has been for sale at the front counter, and some of you have bought it, and you've already read the book, and you know that that is, in fact, the old technical college. Well, it's got a label on, I think, so it's not easy. But that was in Moray Place and was pulled down in 1972. Then it was housing the Inland Revenue Department. And I firmly believe that any building housing the Inland Revenue Department should be pulled down. But the reason for looking at that in terms of the development of radio is that Dunedin became something of a hive of radio activity just before the First World War, and there are a number of stories in the book about amateurs and sometimes young men experimenting with radio and doing quite interesting things. All illegal, because from the very beginning the government decided that radio, which was really a magic thing in those days, was not only magic, but it was too important to be left in the hands of ordinary people. And I think their reasons were probably fairly sound in those times. Ship-to-shore communication was very important. You didn't want amateurs interfering with the signal. During the First World War, there was a great fear that enemy could pick up information from radio broadcasts, and so right through that time, just at the time when the experimenters were getting somewhere, they were outlawed basically, so that all the experiments were officially stopped during the war. But the war did have one advantage in that it developed radio as a medium, especially in military signals, so that at the end of the war there was quite an amount of surplus material left over, as happens in any major warfare situation. So you've heard of Professor Jack, of course, who set up the radio station at the University of Otago and made his first broadcast in 1921. But because of his success, Dunedin gathered a group of people in far greater numbers than any other centre who wanted to experiment with radio. And from that group was formed the Otago Radio Association, and Professor Jack was their patron and helped them with their work. And of course his success in technical terms meant that they were very soon able to cobble together a radio station of their own. That was their first headquarters, not that they took over the whole building, but the point about the technical school is that there were two aspects, I guess. One is the people who were interested in radio because they wanted to know how it worked and to build radio sets and send a signal from Dunedin to Outram and then Dunedin to Oamaru. And by the time Professor Jack was on the air, his broadcasts were being picked up in Wellington and Auckland and other primitive and remote places. So the idea of the Otago Radio Association finding a home in the technical college reflects that. Thomas Scott was the chairman of the technical school, and he was also a heavy on the Otago Radio Association, so we found the rooms for them there. What I'm saying is that in those very early times, radio was very much devoted to building the set and how getting a valve and sending a signal further and all those technical things which really have nothing much to do with radio programming. But interestingly, Professor Jack always saw radio, in spite of being a physicist and wanting to improve signals, he saw it as a means of communication, as a means of bringing the world into the home, or as he put it somewhere in the book, there shouldn't be a farmhouse in New Zealand that can't tune into a talk or a symphony orchestra concert from a town 500 miles away. So the two threads were working together. And so when the Otago Radio Association started, I'm not going to say there were two camps, but there were two areas from which people came. The technical wads, and then the entrepreneurs, the people who wanted to provide entertainment and information. And in that second group, the ones that wanted to make radio programs, not surprisingly, there were people who wanted to sell radios. And this is where you start to get the commercial element that exists. Fred O'Neill at 4YA and Norman Arundel at 4YO Both started stations in 1922, which is the crucial year, 100 years ago. Their motivation was that they were in the business of selling radios, and so they weren't going to sell any radios unless there were some programs to listen to. So both those stations started with the intention of providing entertainment programs. And I think they both did a very, very good job. The Radio Dunedin Otago Radio Association story was similar, but they still had a very strong technical bent as well. However, very shortly, within the Otago Radio Association, people emerged who also wanted to see more entertainment. So what you can see in 1922 is some very rich pickings for people who wanted to listen to things on the radio. Gramophone records were not in favour then. They were used, but you didn't have the kind of pickup that you needed to get a good quality program. They would tend to play a gramophone record and put the microphone up beside the big horn that was on the gramophone. So there was much more emphasis on live programming. Amazing how far more people were heard on the radio in those days than they ever were in later years. And there could be a kind of informality too. Fred O'Neill's 4YA was in Moray Place, and the pipe band on their practice march of an evening would do a circuit of Moray Place. And as they approached 4YA, Fred O'Neill would rush out and guide them into his driveway, and his technician would have a microphone hanging out the window, and then I would say, and now the Roslyn Highland Pipe Band, and the pipe band would play away. Very informal, but local and entertaining. One of the things about looking at what the programs did is the things that they weren't supposed to do. And by now, early 20s, radio had, started to take off, I suppose. About 5,000 people had radio sets in, say, 1922, and that was doubled by 1925. And in some ways, 1925 is a bit of a crucial year, because as the radio licenses increased, the government, which at that time was, an early version of national, decided that the wartime restrictions, to a degree, had to be maintained. And I suppose more specifically, there was a realization that in the United States, radio had become a circus with hundreds of commercial stations doing all kinds of things that were just, in many cases, just a bit beyond the pale. So there was a need not only to control the kind of programming that was being done, but there was also a recognition that radio could be a very powerful influence. Remember, there was no television. What great days. There was just a newspaper once a day, usually for most people, and that was where you got your news. And apart from a renegade newspaper on the West Coast, all New Zealand's daily newspapers were basically pro-conservative government. Later you'd call that pro-national. So the government decided that if radio was to be on the air, it would be very upsetting to their voting figures if, in fact, radio was able to put another point of view forward. So the radio that was once in 1925, when they decided to have a radio or a broadcasting act, the restrictions simply meant you weren't supposed to have any news or political comment, so that spoken programs suffered a great deal, because just at the time when radio could have been bringing news programs, it didn't have them. And there was because of the government's attitude and the influence of the newspaper proprietors, There was no proper broadcasting news service until 1963, 62, 63. Some would say it's still not proper, but the point is there was just, worst of all, for a long time, the 9 o'clock news on the radio was prepared by the Prime Minister's department. And it was accepted that's the way it was. Can you imagine it now? Now the news, here's Jacinda. And she tells you like it is. Well, that's practically what they were doing on radio. But however, by 1925, when they set up the Radio Broadcasting Company by legislation, you might think with that name it might have been an independent firm, but really it was a government department in disguise. In fact, if you have a look at the radio display further along in the museum, you'll find there's an explanation card that tells you that in the 1920s, Radio New Zealand discouraged the private radio stations. I think this business of who did what relies very much on who was around. There was no such thing as Radio New Zealand in the 1920s. The sequence of events, and if anyone can remember this, and next time I come can repeat it for me, there'll be a chocolate fish for you. Before 1925, just the post office running the regulations. 1925, the Radio Broadcasting Company was established, had its headquarters in Christchurch, and would be given the money, the 5 shillings licence fee would be given to them from each listener, and they were obliged to set up 4 main radio stations, Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, Dunedin, and to encourage radio generally. So the Radio Broadcasting Company, full of good intentions, existed until the early 1930s, when the government, still a Conservative government, felt that they weren't really making the progress they should be and set up a thing called the Broadcasting Board. Now, the Broadcasting Board would have been the most, well, I suppose it came closest to a government department in the sense it did nothing but took a lot of money and time to do it. It was the coming of the Labour government in 1935 that saw the greatest change in radio. And you might say, oh, the Labour members wanted more culture. They wanted more community involvement. Well, maybe they did. But they also wanted to get a voice, as I said before. There were no newspapers giving them any time. So that's when Michael Joseph Savage decided to take over radio, which he basically did. I better interrupt this monologue to see how 4XT, Radio Dunedin, are getting on. And I'm told, if I press a button, oh, that's the porn channel. Is that right? I don't know what they do in this place. No, let's see. Oh, just for fun. That's the kind of equipment that the station had in its early days. That's got 4ZB on it, because 4ZB was originally a call sign used by Otago Radio Association. Later, for a bribe, it was taken over by the National Commercial Broadcasting Service. So that's why we had 4ZB Dunedin, and 4ZB became 4XT. Just on the subject of what should a radio station look like, radio is very difficult to illustrate unless you've got a grinning face. There's one at the door of some idiot with a microphone looking at the camera. Now, sometimes someone will take a shot of the studio. Now, that's the 4ZD studio, probably in the 1930s. And I think it's fantastic because it's so down home. The record library is behind you. Anyone who wanders in to sing a song can be accompanied at the piano in front of you, and there's a seat there and a gramophone to play records. How simple it all was. So that's the kind of radio environment that 4XT were able to exist in. After they left the technical college, the Stedman family were always great supporters of radio, and they invited them to take room in that Stedman's garage. That's the Prince of Wales Hotel next door, Princess Street, and that Stedman's garage is now, the front part is now sort of a, well, hard to describe, kind of a modern thing. But the beauty of this business of Stedman's garage is they had good space there, plenty of room, and years later, a listener journalist, a lovely woman that I knew very well, was asked or told by the editor to do a story on this radio station, 4XD, which probably was celebrating its 80th or something. So she may not have come down. She certainly rang around and asked stories, and in the end, she wrote a story, and it talked about this small radio station, which was housed in a member's garage. What she thought was it was housed in his, at home in the garage for his car. The point is, that was the member's garage, which is quite a handsome sort of building. But then she was a northern journalist, and of course we must forgive them. One of the things about buildings is that quite often the building that people were in tells you something of the story of the organisation. So for instance, 4XD in the 30s was very big on live concerts. Much of their airtime was concerts either from their studio or by taking a line to a venue. In the case of Stedman's garage, the room they had wasn't big enough for proper concerts, so Mr. Stedman organised a landline to his own home, and his wife, who was a very prominent singer, was one of the stars of the show, so they broadcast the concerts from their living room. The sort of people who made up the Otago Radio Association, well, you can see they're pretty respectable. Similar clothing and appearance to the people here today. Now that's just a photo I used just to give that's 1940s. The book has got a caption with their names, but they're all either involved in business or entertainment or artistic endeavours. The man in the front row with the bow tie is the famous Toots Mitchell, who was really the life and soul of the whole organisation. Strangely enough, the Otago Radio Association had a dinner on Friday, and they asked me to say a few words. Was there anyone there? Yes. I'm doing a different few words this morning. Got to be careful about that. If you do the same speech twice, it's liable to cause great mayhem. But I was sitting next to the table on Friday night to the man on your far left, man standing there with a rosette or whatever in his. Now his name is John McElroy, and in the 1940s, this might be 1947, don't know. He was a young man who was interested in doing radio. Now, all those years later, here he was sitting beside me. And so I guess he's about 90 now, which is older even than some of us. And he had a perfect memory of just the little funny things that I wish I'd known before we printed this thing. And some of the things about radio, nothing to do with government policy and listening figures and so on, it's the kind of things that a small radio station could get up to in their daily activities. And John was telling me that back in the 50s, they were always very keen to broadcast the sound of the last Rattray Street cable car, the Spates Special, as it left in High Street, Rattray Street. And he said their studio was in Rattray Street, and just after 6 o'clock, his program was called Tea Time Tunes. Lovely title. But they wouldn't start Tea Time Tunes until one of the blokes had rushed out onto the Rattray Street and the Spate Special cable car had gone past, and the grip man on the cable car would always give the old bell a big ding, ding, ding. So this was a fascinating radio, the live broadcast of the Spate Special bell. And John said when he heard the bell, he could say, "Yes, it's time again for Tea Time Tunes." Away he'd go. Yeah, lots of good stories. Oh, that's the scene where it happened. See, if you look at radio stations and media organisations, they tend to want to look pretty impressive from the front and impress their clients. Well, 4XD didn't need to do that. They didn't have advertising. They didn't need clients. So they ended up taking up an offer from Calder Mackay, and that's the edge of the old Calder Mackay building on your right-hand side. Calder Mackay, a very astute organisation, realised that if they had the radio station in their building, they would get some free advertising. Not only that, but the manager was a staunch Otago Radio supporter. So they offered space to 4XD. I'll show you another photo in a moment, but inside the main store, there was a large room they could use for their studio for concerts and large gatherings. But in the alleyway, where according to police reports, unpleasant happenings often occurred, that's why they put the hurricane fence in the front. The actual studio was down the alleyway, and that front building was a fish and chip shop. However, this is the kind of environment that they were in, down home, homely stuff. So that's where they were. And they were allowed, they couldn't do commercials, but they were permitted to say, "This is Radio 4XD, broadcasting from the premises of Calder Mackay in Rattray Street." And of course, people got to know that, but it was like a free ad for Calder Mackay. Okay, that's just an example. That was the closing of the His Majesty's Theatre, 1952 or something. And that's how the station was covering events which quite often the other stations weren't. How are we doing? Okay. They haven't changed the clock. We've got an hour and a half to go. We got in our chronology, we got to the Labour government in 1935 and Michael Joseph Savage in the election campaign. Remember, we still have this group of radio stations that were independent, B-class stations, and Dunedin was foremost among them. Dunedin had half a dozen B-class stations, which is as many as the rest of the country put together. They were rather concerned about their future, whether they would be allowed to exist, because the national government was obviously trying to squeeze them off the air. But Michael Joseph Savage said, "The Labour government will not interfere with the freedom and future of the B-class stations." And they were elected. And then Michael Joseph Savage said, "We're going to close the B-class stations." You see, in politics, there's no such thing as a promise, a real promise. It's a political promise. And once you're elected, well, it's not a promise anymore. It's just something you might have said vaguely. So all the B-class stations, the policy was to buy them and close them down. So gradually they were all bought out for, I suppose, what would be called reasonably fair prices. But when it came to the Otago Radio Association, 4XD, they refused to sell. And only one other station in the country also refused to sell. So from 20 or 30 B-class private stations, they all disappeared, apart from 4XD. and it became, I suppose, the flag bearer of independence. The radio system itself became the National Broadcasting Service, which was a government department. Shortly afterwards, and this is the most amazing thing, should government be involved in commercial radio or commercial television? There, that question stunned you. I've never believed it should. Seemed very, very strange. However, the beauty of the system as far as the Labour government was concerned is that by controlling radio stations, they would at last have a voice, which they didn't have among the conservative newspapers, and then by setting up a commercial organisation, they would get some income which could pay for the whole shooting box. So that's basically how this NZ National Broadcasting Service, National Commercial Broadcasting Service came about. After the war, it became the New Zealand Broadcasting Service. In 1962, it became the New Zealand Broadcasting Corporation, and I was hired as a 16-year-old disc jockey, thankfully not for long. And then, of course, the NZBC came a whole bunch of other things, and the remnants of it would be Radio New Zealand, and you could hardly call TVNZ a remnant of the old NZBC days. So trying to legislate to join the NZBC or the TVNZ and Radio New Zealand into one monolithic organisation, a wee bit like, I suppose, proposing a merger between the House of Pleasure in High Street and the First Church up on the hill. Very hard to see it working, but anyway, that's brought us up to date in terms of how broadcasting was organised, but running right through the background was this, eventually the last of the independent radio stations, surviving on donations, and when Professor Shelley, who was running the National Broadcasting Service, decided that actually 4XD was no threat to his own stations and probably deserved a bit of support, he decided he would make an annual grant of £100. 1945, quite handy to have. In 1975-74, the New Zealand Broadcasting Corporation was still making a donation of £100, which meant that by 1974, the £100 was not going terribly far. And the 4XD, just keeping on the air with no income, became a major problem. They maintained their service simply through volunteers, which proves the fact that quite often very good outcomes can come from a volunteer organisation when the professionals will try and tell you that they're the only ones that know how it should be done. It was probably because of the shortage of money that 4XD gained something of a reputation of being God's radio station, because religious organisations are very keen to get airtime, especially what I would call perhaps not the mainstream. The NZBC, NZBS gave airtime to the mainstream churches, but for the more evangelical types, it was hard to get on air. So for many years, through the 50s, 60s, 70s, 4XD, especially on a Sunday, became a string of church broadcasts, many of them American. The Americans had developed quite sophisticated international organisations where they would ship out recordings of their preachers, bringing people closer to God, and also they would pay for the airtime. It's quite handy to have. So that was really a matter of survival, although the members of the 4XD group were not particularly keen on a constant diet of religious programming. In fact, one meeting of the Otago Radio Association, one very zealous member was at the bar, they were having a few drinks, and he was told that the next round is on the Otago Radio Association, organisation's shouting its members. And he said, I wonder whether it's correct that we should be taking a free drink at the bar when we know that all the costs are actually being covered by donations from the Presbyterian Church. I think he still had the drink, but the point was that everywhere you looked, there was points were raised that meant it wasn't going to be a suitable way to carry on. Not only that, but as interesting and as fascinating as these church broadcasts were, remember the ones that originated in America had to be severely edited because they would arrive with, and if you want to help the world, help make the world a better place and bring God into every home in this nation, all you have to do is send $250 to P.O. Box 594, Tallahassee, Mississippi, Tennessee. Wow. And it was seen inappropriate that New Zealand listeners should have to bear with this stuff, so they had to be edited out. And there was obviously, by the late 80s, it was time to change. And the drama will certainly begin in a moment. I'll just check on the slideshow, see where we are. Oh, here's one, just to illustrate the role of the radio station in promoting local talent. Now, the mainstream stations like 4YA would now and again have a broadcast of Dunedin contralto Frida Krint in songs by Schubert, once in a blue moon. And she would be vetted by people who were expecting characters in Dunedin and in Invercargill and Timaru to be Covent Garden type people. Wasn't that way. So for someone who would just enjoy perhaps having a good singing voice or a group that had an act that was worth listening to, they would end up being on the Smile family on 4XD. And that photo looks like 1940s to me, and I'd love to know who some of these youngsters are, because they'd now be in their 80s or getting on a bit, and the young lady in a school uniform singing away, she may have become another Kiri Tikanawa, don't know. Just a pity sometimes that group photos don't have captions. But that was part of the radio station's role, promoting local talent. Oh, here's a close-up of that alleyway I was telling you. That brick building was the radio station, and there's much talk about what was going on behind the green door. So by the time that photo was taken, the old fish and chip shop had been destroyed. So there you go. Imagine TVNZ accepting that as their premises. Suit them though. One of the most interesting and unusual aspects of radio was the fact that when 4XD was given a stronger signal, it interfered with the signal coming from a Christchurch radio station called 3ZM, which was sort of pop music. And 3ZM had a very dedicated fan in Dunedin who found that he couldn't listen to pop music on 3ZM because 4XD was interfering with it. Many of us would simply write a letter saying, is some way I can get this fixed? Or they might go to their radio shop and say, is there some adjustment that can be made? But this young man decided the best way to answer the problem was to burn the transmitter down. Well, it certainly solved his problem, but it also meant that 4XD was off the air. Interestingly, that caravan was owned by the BCNZ, and there was a constant history of cooperation between the NZBC or BCNZ or whatever, between government radio and television and 4XD, because it was never seen as threatening. They had no commercials, very small listenership, So the cooperation was quite brilliant. Josie Cooper, who was on the air for about 70 odd years, I think, just a typical example of someone who week after week would turn up and do her radio program and thoroughly enjoy it. I mentioned this business when we looked at the fire damage, that other stations were starting to come on the air and their input and impact needs to be assessed. Well, in 1971, Radio Otago started, and it blew the socks off 4ZB, which was the NZBC station. Radio Otago was local. It was focused on the community. It was also probably a little more venturesome in how it approached radio, both through its personalities and the kind of programming it did. And it formed a bit of a liaison with 4XD. Interestingly, I'm told that when Radio Otago decided to have a Golden Oldies weekend, they didn't have any Golden Oldies. So 4XD gave them a whole pile of old hit records that they could play. That kind of cooperation became much more formal when, after the establishment of what's called Radio Dunedin, Radio Dunedin became something of a force in the commercial radio field. See if I can find some of these characters. That's Colin Lehman, the curator and minder of Charlie Mouse. One of the best broadcasters Dunedin's ever had. Remember Colin? Yes. Yeah. Well, he joined Radio Dunedin and did the breakfast show. That picture is Colin at the new transmitter in the not sure the year, but he has made the point that valve, which was on display as an historic artefact, is exactly the same age as he is. Right, there we go. And perhaps best known was Neil Collins, whose role was crucial to this story. Neil had been working with 4ZB for years until they didn't think it through. They decided they wanted a different image, so they made him redundant. And thereafter, were backpedaling because they'd lost what I would call one of those down-home broadcasters. He wasn't trying to sound like someone who was smart and knew it all, but he was able to communicate with, as he put it, the people next door. And so his program, when he persuaded the Otago Radio Association to go commercial in the early 1990s, became extremely high rating. And the station, now called Radio Dunedin, became something of a force to be reckoned with in the commercial radio world. And once you become good at something, there'll be somebody who wants to buy you. So Radio Otago decided that it would be good to have Radio Dunedin within their stable, offering a slightly different program to what they were doing. So through a whole bunch of permutations, Radio Dunedin still exists, and it's part of a Media Works company. What's interesting, I'm looking at the clock because not only have my ears gone, my eyes have gone as well. That's coming up to the hour, isn't it? Yeah, thank you. So luckily, in some ways, I've blown it if you had questions, but I can tell you now that I don't know the meaning of life, and I don't know who's going to win the Women's Rugby World Cup, so I wouldn't have been able to answer your questions anyway. But there's one point I would make. Oh, that's Flash. And it's all in the book. It's all in the book, brothers and sisters, available at your nearest Early Settlers Museum. Now, I know it's been a bit disjointed, but I'm reminded by thinking about all this of the things that after, I don't know, I probably spent, next year it'll be 60 years since I was first hired by a radio organisation. And I often think about the role of broadcasting, and it's always seemed to me that one of the things I liked or enjoyed about the Otago Radio Association, which I never worked for, but because I write books 25 years ago, they said, would you write our history, or booklet more than a book? I was happy to do so. And I called it An Independent Air. Quite clever, isn't it? Because at that stage, what impressed me most of all was in the whole midst of broadcasting's comings and goings, Radio Dunedin, or 4XD as it was then, had maintained its independence. It answered to no one, within reason, but there was no corporation, there was no government department making up the programs, telling them how to do it. Since then, having become part of a fully commercial organisation, I just wonder, as I said when we started this morning, whether under a commercial regime, remembering that Radio Dunedin is now part of another big organisation, Media Works, who may decide that they don't actually need that station. What will the future hold? Who knows? But I will end with the way I started, saying that it won't take another 100 years for radio to be completely changed, if to exist at all. So, you may have actually lived through radio's golden age. Pretty exciting, isn't it? Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Jim. Will we have time for a few questions? I think we should have. It's a pity to let you go without a few questions. Any questions for Jim? Ooh, you've covered it all. Oh, yes.
It's not a question, it's a comment. I worked on Radio Christmas Island in the 60s, BLU2. We did our own programs. One of the first ones you showed was we had the turntables on each side of you and so on and so on. So that's that. When I came back to New Zealand in the 80s, I was looking for something to do, so I went as a volunteer. And I put on this program, which I thought was pretty good. And you know Ivan Rebroff, the marvellous singer. And I put him on and so on. And I finished with saying, he could put his shoes under my bed any time. And do you know, they never asked me back.
Very short-sighted of them, very.
Now, any other quick questions? Well, I'd just like to thank Jim very much for coming all the way from Patearoa, which is up in the sticks, up there in the other part of Otago. And I think it's really interesting to hear about the radio for 100 years. And I still love listening to the radio. And I'd be really, really sad if we didn't have radio. So on behalf of all of us, I thank you very, very much for coming. And I also thank the Toitū staff for organising this and videoing it, which I'll put on the website. And I thank you all very much for coming. So have a lovely day. Thank you.
Good. Okay. Thank you.